Welcome to Why Do We Do That, a psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their field. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I talked to Dr. Christopher Hafen. Chris is an associate professor of psychology at Northern Virginia Community College. His research background deals with adolescence, peer relationships, and identity development. Chris and I had a discussion about a variety of topics related to adolescent social development, one of which is this shift that we've seen in the past 30 years away from in-person social interaction to a more digital or online environment. And I think it's important to pay attention to that shift because I think it's fundamentally altered how young people learn to socialize. I think the data is pretty clear that there is a lot more social anxiety associated with social interactions than they're used to, and I think a lot of that can be attributed to this preferred modality of interacting via, whether it's text or through gaming, that these interactions have become the new norm, and they're not necessarily what the type of interaction that has historically formed or built the ability for young people to interact in a social environment. We also talked about the role that parents play in this process of emotional and social development. So even though I'm not a parent, I think that aside from keeping your children healthy and providing them a sense of structure, the most important thing that parents do for their kids is to help them categorize their emotions, to walk them through their feelings in real time when they encounter a stressful event or something that bothers them. And as we touched on in this episode, social rejection is one of those specific domains that if a young teen is unequipped to handle, you can see some massive long-term consequences. And it's interesting because parents can serve as a model for the inner monologue that teens need in order to deal with these types of stressors. So if a young teen, for example, is upset because their friend hasn't texted them back for a few hours, and maybe they vent to their parents saying, so and so isn't responding to my text, parents have this opportunity to help their child challenge these ideas. So how do you know their phone hasn't died? How do you know they're just not busy? Why do you think that it's something personal with you? All of these questions are what makes a healthy inner monologue to help teenagers challenge these sort of negative beliefs that they hold. So I hope you enjoy our discussion. Chris and I are, aside from having gone to graduate school together, we're also very close friends, and you can tell by some of the friendly ribbing that goes on during this discussion, but I hope you enjoy it. Let's get right into it. You have an extensive research history looking at adolescence and friendships and stuff like that related to the area of developmental psychology. So why don't you just set it up for us? What are some of the key developments that occur during adolescence?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing is, adolescence really hasn't been a thing for that long. So if you go back to the early 1900s in this country when school became mandatory for everyone, then you had this period where instead of teenagers going into the workforce, suddenly they were expected to go to school. And that meant they had time to a prolonged period of time where they were allowed to kind of be immature. And so the adolescence that we know now, didn't always exist. So,
so what ages are we talking about here?
Well, it depends, but typically people think of adolescence as sort of the onset of puberty until, roughly 18. is sort of typically thought of as the period of adolescence, and puberty's happening earlier at an earlier age now than it did, but you figure somewhere around 12 or 13 typically. So in terms of key markers or key tasks, really the number one thing on stage is the development of identity and development of sort of a coherent sense of identity. And for most people, especially nowadays, that's not going to end in adolescence. It's going to be something that's started in kind of that early adolescent stage, and it's going to continue for quite a while. And then obviously, as that identity is developing, part of the sort of secondary cast or the development of intimate relationships and an understanding of what it means to be in an intimate relationship. And that comes online really largely with friendships first, usually, and then later romantic relationships.
So identity seems like it could mean a lot of different things, right? You could have you could have social roles, personality traits. What are there specific key pieces of identity that need to come online? And if there isn't enough, if there isn't a cohesive enough identity, that it tends to lead to negative outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, well, really, if you think about identity as identity, as you point out, is multifaceted. So talking about it abstractly doesn't really work. And but if you just take the personality is a good starting point, because that really starts to develop. Well, really, by the end of infancy, we have a sense of self that's starting to develop, of recognizing that we are different than other people. And we're born with different researchers call it different things, but most people agree that we're born with a temperamental style, meaning, some of us are more prone to overstimulation, and some of us, and those people tend to, as they get older, tend to develop more of what you might call, in terms of personality, introversion, or kind of just being less comfortable in novel social situations. Others of us, will soak up any information in the environment, and so we tend to be, more social and more willing to engage in random acts with other people. And as we get into adolescence, you have this kind of weird compilation of things where we have more freedom, so we have more time to interact with others socially. We have greater kind of cognitive ability, so we understand things in more abstract terms, and so we can think about ourselves in these different ways. And so in terms of identity development, what that means is we've got more opportunity to explore who we are, and who we are in different spheres, who we are in school, who we are with friends, who we are internally, which we may or may not share that with everybody. And at the same time, we're internally we've got hormones and everything going on that's just sort of changing our physical appearance. It's changing how we think about the world, and so it's really that internal process that sort of sparks a curiosity that sort of leads people to this kind of notion that there's something about them that's unique, and figuring out how to explore that, while at the same time we want to fit in. So, and that's oftentimes stunting our ability to actually explore this notion of development in terms of identity. So, I think talking about one aspect would be difficult, because they're all interrelated in the sense that they all sort of encompass who we are and how we're developing in the world. But the social aspects are certainly really key.
So this, if I'm interpreting what you're hearing correctly, now more than ever, it's been easier to get feedback about ourselves in terms of our identity, right? So, now, obviously, when you and I were youngsters, we didn't have all this social media.
Use the term youngsters anymore.
Yeah, so is that outdated? When we were tots, when we were Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's better. Okay.
Is that better?
Yeah.
When we were when we were younger, we were exposed. I'm 37. You're around that age. We were exposed to a little bit of social media, and social media does kind of it provides this breeding ground for understanding others easily, because you have profiles instead of having to dig through conversation. But to the same point, you can learn more about yourself, because you have to fill out this profile, and you have to put decorate it. And back in the day when it was MySpace, you would decorate it. So in terms of where we are now versus where we were 20, 30 years ago, is it possible that being able to that because we're exposed to all this potential information about ourselves, and we're ramping up our ability to understand ourselves, is it possible that makes us more self-focused in a negative way?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One is it gives you more of an opportunity to like, as you put it, you get more information, but you're also getting more information in a very superficial way. So, to really kind of understand, to understand yourself, but also to understand others, and to really get into the depths of that development of identity, it's more than just, I like to do this and that person likes to do this, but then that person doesn't like to do that. It's more of like, how does that get integrated into the complexity of how I feel when, I'm at school and I want to be friends with someone, but they don't seem to want to be friends with me back. And so you do get this, it's almost more of a kind of a fragile identity development that starts to exist, because you've got a period of development where people are more likely to sort of put aside their individual identity to fit in anyway, and that's typical in adolescent development. But then now you've got it where you're not doing that in a social situation, you're doing it in a sort of mock social situation where you think something may be going on in terms of how someone's living their life, but they're just showing you snapshots or pieces, or literally in some instances, short videos or snapshots of what they want you to think is going on in their life. And so you're really just forming this based on your perceptions of what's going on.
This is an idea that I struggle with too, because I've talked to lots of folks who a large percentage of their socialization occurs in a gaming setting,
right,
with the
sure.
headset as their, and so upside, well, there is some shared goals, when you're playing a first person shooter game.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's completely devoid of social benefit, right? But
right. And it's also a safer environment. You're taking less personal risks when you're in that environment in terms of the initial entry into the situation.
Right. Which is why, I'm not going to go on a tirade about how all socialization is taking place in these gaming settings.
No, right. Sure.
I think, yeah. My concern is that even though you're actually interacting in real time, it's still missing. There's still kind of a missing social contract. You're not, because you're not living in the same city. It's not like you have to coordinate plans to meet up with somebody down this, for dinner or for drinks or something like that. And there's very little nonverbal cue reading, right? So with these online presences, you don't go through that process of watching your friend respond to something you said, and then realizing, oh, I shouldn't have said that, right? You have this it's just a headset and a voice. Do you think that do you think that is having an impact in terms of how people are learning, how people are applying what they learn in the digital world to face-to-face interactions?
So I think there's two things to that. I think one thing for sure is this idea of losing a bit of that in the moment, reading the situation, reading reactions. All that plays heavily into our ability to develop kind of a understanding of emotions and an understanding of, some of relationships and friendships are about knowing when you can share your feelings like wholeheartedly and when you have to, pull back on those a little bit because the other person can't handle it or it's not really appropriate given the current context. And I think that's missing quite a bit in development, especially in early adolescence now, to where that does two things. One, it means when you're in a face-to-face interaction and you're actually, having to go through that process, it's more uncomfortable, but it's also there's a discomfort that I think adolescents are feeling with, other people then not seeing those cues for themselves, because they can't even recognize them oftentimes in themselves when they're coming up. And so you see more anxiety. I mean, the spikes in anxiety in particular. There are lots of reasons for that, but a large part of that, I think, is just a lack of ability to know how to handle that back and forth, because it's, you face a lot of, rejection. You face a lot of kind of personal struggles that come along with social relationships. And when you've formed your ability to understand yourself through a lot of social media interaction and a lot of online interaction that doesn't really require that back and forth, then you don't necessarily have a script for how to handle, when things aren't going well.
Right. So speaking of rejection, so you
Are we going to talk about your dating life now?
Yes. Speaking of rejection, why am I alone?
I don't think we have time for that today.
Yeah, that'll be for another podcast. Yeah. So you had some pretty interesting research looking at specifically young males and what causes them to be sensitive to rejection.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, basically, I mean, from the time, we grew up in the 80s. So, this is not a new thing, and it's maybe a little bit better now, but still, if you look at how we sort of talk to boys and girls differently in childhood, it's still very much prevalent. I've got a 6-year-old, and I notice that the way in which, I mean, even myself, but certainly family members, everything, the way we talk to him is different than the way we talk to our girls, and what that does is oftentimes we're encouraging expression differently in young boys and girls, such that girls are often encouraged or rewarded when they express their emotions verbally. And so we're essentially training them to think about their emotions and discuss their emotions and process them in a more linguistic way, whereas we don't often encourage that in the same way with boys. Instead, we it's sort of this kind of stereotypical view going way back of like, it's better for a boy to learn to kind of hold their emotions in. And when they experience frustrations, we give them more leeway to express those physically, whether it's, acting out or whatever the method may be. We encourage them into sports that are more active and girls into activities that typically require a little bit more kind of patience and thought as they're going through the process. And so as boys get older, they don't really have typically the same skill set for dealing with frustrations, particularly for dealing with, frustrations in a social situation where, it's not okay for a 13-year-old boy to act out physically when they experience frustration the same way that they learned when they were maybe 4 or 5. And so they don't really have a good toolkit to work with. And so when they get into romantic relationships, and this is largely what that research was discussing, is, when they experience frustration, as we all do in a romantic relationship, their method for dealing with that often goes back to what is automatic and internal for them, which in extreme cases is what often leads to violence in relationships. But in even less extreme cases, they don't really know how to handle rejection. They don't really know if they're not getting what they want. They don't know how to go about that. And so if you think about identity, they don't have a coherent identity that sort of gives them a toolkit for dealing with the rejection, and that gets in the way of how they process that frustration.
So that's very interesting. Now, does this, so are there skills for females that are neglected in the same way that for boys? So from what I'm hearing is that there's this based on whatever gender norms, this type of behavior in boys of expressing themselves emotionally isn't fostered. Is there a similar version of that for girls?
Yeah, so with girls, it's sort of the reverse. It's the same coin, I guess, but the other side, which is that if you're constantly asked to evaluate your feelings and think about your feelings, rather than sort of getting the leeway to express frustrations in a more outward way, what starts to happen is that process starts to get internalized. And so as you get older, and this could be true for boys just as much as girls, it's just the nature of it tends to be more prevalent in girls. As you get older, when you experience frustration in a friendship, in a romantic relationship, at school, because maybe you're struggling in a subject, instead of thinking outwardly or talking to other people about those frustrations, it starts to become an internal process that's almost defeating. And so you develop this mentality that you're not good enough or that you're not able enough. And some of that work that you mentioned earlier found that for girls that experienced sensitivity towards rejection in early adolescence, as they moved through adolescence, if that sensitivity increased, meaning like maybe they had struggles in friendships or relationships that was creating more of that internal struggle, then they tended to develop very submissive styles in relationships, meaning they started to, put aside what they wanted or what they thought was best, and instead just adopted whatever their partner felt like was appropriate or what their partner wanted. And so, in a totally opposite way, those two types of, those two archetypes, the male who's overly dominant and that's all they know how to do in terms of handling relationships, and the female who starts to develop sensitivity and then internalize everything, that's where you get sort of the sort of early adult relationship or late adolescent relationship that's really, maladaptive for both, but where they're both kind of getting what they want out of the relationship because that's what they've learned to kind of orient to in the world.
So when I first started hearing about this research, my mind went to this sounds like it's something that would be a process that would start much earlier on with parental relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the same way that kids have they have attachment to their parents, that's the first real intimate relationship they have, and that's and it's at the parental level that where you develop either, if your parent is too overbearing, then you end up being risk averse and it's overstimulated. If your parent is distant, then you end up being in sort of chaotic relationships as you get older. So how much of this is driven by the parental relationship versus the social relationships that develop along the way in terms of friends?
Yeah, so there's definitely the early markers are those parental relationships, those sibling relationships, those sort of core family relationships that exist, because that sets your expectation. So once if you're an infant and you need food, or you are learning to walk and you fall and you hurt yourself, and you have somebody there, typically a parent, that gives you the food or that helps you up and gives you a hug and makes you feel better, you start to learn that you can go out and explore the world, and that everything's going to be okay. Like if something happens, I've got people in my life that, and you're not thinking this at the time, but that's the expectation that starts to form. So when you go into, school and preschool or kindergarten, and, you're learning about peer relationships, you're going in with the best possible circumstances because you're expecting good things. And throughout life, if you expect good things, typically you're more likely to experience good things. If the opposite happens, like you said, if you have a parent who's distant and avoidant, or if you have a parent who's constantly, not letting you do anything and never develop a sense of autonomy, then you go into those same early peer interactions, not expecting the world to work out perfectly. And so you carry those perceptions with you into the social sphere. And surely if you look at adolescence, what you'll see as people start to form relationships is there's a pretty good bit of consistency. It's in sort of mathematical terms, statistical terms, it's a correlation that tends to be somewhere around 0.5 or 0.6, which means you're carrying a big deal of consistency, but there's still a lot of variance that, aren't explained by early parent relationships. And that's just kind of the notion that they set the stage, but they're certainly not a determinant. But it's a pattern, a set of expectations that forms that can be very difficult to overcome. And if you look at, I teach developmental psychology at a community college now, and when I talk to 19 and 20-year-olds about attachment and about the consistencies of attachment as they move into adolescence and into early adulthood, inevitably I have a handful of students come up after class and say, I never thought about how my parents reacted towards me when I was little, and why it has such a big impact over how I am now. And it's like mind blowing.
Who'd have thunk? Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, what your parents do matters. It's, so, but there's always cases and always opportunities to kind of come past or move past those early experiences. It's very difficult because they set sort of automatic expectations that if you're not, accessing them and becoming aware of them, they can start to sort of lead your life for you rather than you making the decisions yourself.
Mm-hmm. So your research basically suggests that when these young boys don't have an outlet to expressing themselves emotionally, it basically can corrode how they end up having romantic relationships. Now,
or more specifically, how they deal with the stress in those romantic relationships.
Right. Okay. Right. The rejection. Right. The rejection
right.
piece. Right. Okay. So what is what is this happy medium? So if we're observing, right, that the big issue with boys is that they don't have an opportunity to express themselves emotionally. The issue with girls is that they might internalize stress from rejection, and that doesn't have that leads to negative outcomes. What is the happy medium here, and is it the same? Is it the same for males and females?
That's a good question. I think the as is the case with most social science, the truth is that it's more complex than that. So there is no one script for how to go about it. I think the two things that are vital are one, early on with parents, with teachers, kind of the awareness that always following the same script doesn't usually work. So if you're always using the same way to deal with a child who's acting out, or a child who's shy, and you're doing the same things over and over and over, what you're doing is really not giving them a proper access to kind of a wide range of ways to overcome their struggle. So a really shy kid, there's not one way to make them less shy. You're not going to sort of change their internal kind of way of operating, but you've got to try different strategies to kind of unlock that a little bit. A boy who's constantly acting out is incredibly frustrating for teachers, for parents, for other kids that they have to interact with. But the key is, how do you deal with that frustration, and how do you find different strategies? So some of that's got to be, talking to the child and trying to access, like, what's going on when you're upset? Why are you going about doing that? And some of the strategies got to be just give them more opportunities on a daily basis to be more active. So maybe some of that physical frustration isn't just sort of exploding in a situation where they become frustrated. As they get older. Oh, go ahead.
Well, especially for boys, is there's been minor changes to the school environment over the past 30, 40 years, well, probably longer than that, but just it's the actual structure of school doesn't even have an outlet for some of their physical energy, right?
No, and that's true not just of boys, but for girls, it's just the especially the early elementary setup. It doesn't jive well with what we know about where they are in terms of development. It's always this constant battle between academic development and social development. But the truth is, at that age, the academic stuff is only really optimally accessed if you give them proper opportunities to deal with the social environment and to be physical and to sort of access kind of the emotion regulation abilities that are coming online at 4 and 5. And so
I've seen these schools that have this extreme view of education where it's kind of heavily free play and low on the academics, and at first glance it's like, wow, look at all the interacting and the play, like based on what we know about how play has such positive impacts so I'm actually teaching I'm teaching a course now called Psychology of Play, and they're simply playing has tons of cognitive benefits, physical benefits that it's not learning arithmetic, but it's equally important and probably more important to have that before you get into the arithmetic.
But then the question becomes, at some point in education, you've also got to teach the ability of it kind of inhibiting, what you want to do versus what is required of you. And, part of that radical approach of going all the way to that side would be, you'd also have to include opportunities for them to start to learn those abilities. You get some of that in social interaction because you can't always get your way with other kids, but so having to actually sit and focus on something that's directed by an adult or by another member of the classroom, there is functional there is functional development happening in those circumstances as well.
So, I'm not advocating for, the extreme play school versus something more traditional, but you touched on something interesting, the self-regulatory piece of child development. Even I would make the argument that even in these open play settings, to a certain extent, you are still learning self-regulation, right? You've got, sure. Because through interacting with kids, if a kid doesn't like something you did physically or verbally, they might walk away, they might push them, and you get live, contingencies. They're learning, oh, I can't do that. Maybe I can't do that. Maybe I need to tone it down or something like that. But yeah, I hear what you're saying about, a balance between the structure of traditional schooling and the play of open.
The truth of that also is that really requires very savvy and in touch adults that can manage those circumstances without letting those circumstances get out of hand. And you just think about our culture now is we safeguard kids way too much around everything. So imagine, if you took that and implemented that setting where you had teachers who were kind of checked out, as unfortunately often happens in the education profession because of various factors, and then you had kids just free playing, and you had kids in the classroom who had behavioral problems, and you could just imagine how that could get out of hand really quickly as well, if that's all they were ever doing and they weren't very well regulated. So, it's like anything else. I think it's a balance, but I do think more opportunities towards that aspect of development would certainly enhance what we were talking about, which is this notion of figuring out, how do you start to enable kids to develop their identity, especially in the social sphere, a little bit earlier, rather than, they get to adolescence and they start getting into romantic relationships and they really just don't know what to do. They don't know how to do. And, given what we know about how they interact with friends in later childhood and adolescence, mostly electronically, they're not getting the opportunities there. So school really should be the opportunity, especially early school should be the opportunity to start to foster those processes.
Yeah. So, I would recommend anyone listening to check out The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist, which is similar to my background, but it was a fantastic, argument for how children that were born roughly in the mid to late 90s, where they don't have a world without internet, that's where we're seeing this profile of being extremely sensitive to social situations, lacking what you would call grit and stuff like that. Definitely worth checking that out. So let's talk about friendship in general a little bit. So, and this doesn't just have to be adolescence, obviously, but the traditional question is it number of friends, or is it just quality of friends? Is that do we know, is that question answered as of now?
Well, is it answered? I mean, it does depend on what aspect, but by and large, when it comes to physical health, when it comes to emotional health, when it comes to mental health, it always comes back to, and this is true in early childhood, this is true in later childhood, adolescence, or even into adulthood. It's really just about quality of friendships, and more than that, it's really about having key people in your life. And when I say people, it's an important thing about friendships that they're horizontal. We sort of delineate between horizontal and vertical relationships in childhood, where you don't have a choice who your parents are. You don't, I mean, to some extent you might in certain circumstances, but for the most part, that relationship is very, top down. They set the standards and you sort of live by them. And friendships give us this opportunity to interact with someone else, and we can share what we want to share and interact with them in the way we want to interact with them. And you can have lots and lots of friends, but if you don't have friends that, when something goes down and you really need someone, if you don't have people that you can count on, you tend to struggle, and that's at any stage of life. And when you do have people you can count on, it turns out we're pretty resilient. We can get through just about anything, as long as we do have those people in our life, those handful of people. And for most people, that's not going to be this big, huge network. They're going to be key people in your life that you can go to with the good or the bad, and they're going to give you that response that you need. They might not be able to fix it, but they're going to be able to help you see things in the way that's going to help you move forward. So
so that makes sense to me. The one thing that I'm starting to realize now is that obviously with Instagram being such a big thing in terms of how people are connected,
mm-hmm.
that the collective nature of gathering friends and people that you follow on social media, like the collective piece where it feels like, I want as many as I can. Mm-hmm. I want to, you should follow me. Within the first 3 minutes of meeting somebody, they're telling
right.
you to follow them on social media. It's like they're just that as this network grows, each individual relationship seems like it takes a hit. It gets more and more fragile. And I had a thought the other day that, like, is this? I think networking, the concept of networking is partially to blame, right? That this idea that I think young people, when they hear the word networking, instead of thinking developing deep relationships with people, they see it as network. Oh, network means make contact and then share and then make sure they follow you on social media.
Well, there's two sides to that, because one could be, you could argue that the wider your network, the larger your network, the more your opportunities are for finding and deeply connecting with people that could turn into very valuable close friends. I don't think that tends to happen very often. I think you're right that it's much more of this. Let me build my numbers in my network so that when I post a photo, I can get the random, the extra random 50 likes that will, consistently make me look like, I've got this, this huge circle of friends. The downside more than that is really, we don't post a whole lot of our true self on Instagram or, really any form of social media. And in fact, in most cases, they're restricted to sort of snapshots in ways that don't really allow you to sort of fully communicate what's going on with you. And so, when you do post something really amazing, you do tend to get, a decent number of that network to respond to it. When you post something that's maybe a little bit more something you're struggling with, you tend to get less of a response. And so it's sort of this, kind of weird interaction where you're not really getting the back and forth. You're just getting, you're just getting what sort of feedback that, we don't really care to know all of you. We just care to know, cool things that are going on, or cool, funny videos, or, and you almost have friends that, when they post something, it's like scroll, versus friends that you're like, oh, it's because when we go on social media, we're going for an escape. We're not going to like really dive into reality. We're going because we're kind of trying to get away from reality for a little bit.
Right. I think some on top of that, there is this somewhat kind of dangerous tendency that I'll see now and then where people are like using social media as a cry for help,
Well, there's that, yes.
which is not a good. It's not a really good vehicle if you're this is something that you need to be calling a friend or talking to them in person. And if we've convinced ourselves that this type of socializing is normal, then when something serious comes about, we're not going to get the outcome we need. We're not going to get that actual friend conversing and putting their arm around you. You're just going to get you'll get some comments that are more fluff, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the, and I say this to my kids at times because it was wired into me when I was younger. It was like this notion of like, don't cry wolf, because then when the wolf comes, it's, no one's going to be there for you. It's kind of this you get used to anytime something's struggling, you turn it into this bigger thing because it does get some response from sort of the social media sphere. And for the moment, it feels good because it's like, okay, good, people are on my side. But then, that only lasts for a period of time until people start to get frustrated by that. And then, you may actually be struggling. I mean, there's certainly an element of people that do that because they don't have any other way of reaching out. And then when it really gets down to the point where they're like at home with a bottle of alcohol and pills and they put out a post, like, they're not going to get the same response that they got when they first started doing that, maybe 6 months before that. It's also easier if you're a friend of the person to sort of treat it anonymously rather than like if I had a friend call me and say, hey, I'm really struggling today and, I'm feeling really depressed and I just haven't been feeling myself for a long time. I'd respond to that very differently than if I saw a friend post something to that effect on, some version of social media. And it's kind of that depersonalization that we were talking about earlier. It's sort of part and parcel of how most teenagers grow up communicating now. It's just they're not used to a face-to-face interaction in the way that that at times might be more beneficial or more helpful.
Mm-hmm. So let's bring everything full circle, right? So let's say you're a parent and you've got a few things you're juggling. One of them is making sure that your children are able to express themselves emotionally. You want to make sure that they have effective friendships. Do you have or is there any practical advice that you could give to a parent to achieve some of these key goals?
Well, I think so. There's two ways that I think parents tend to approach this. One is this notion of, well, I didn't have a cell phone growing up, so you're not going to get a cell phone, and I'm not going to let you have a cell phone, and this really hardline approach, which doesn't really work for various reasons. It's like, hey, I'm not going to teach you how to handle this functionally. I'm just going to help you avoid it until you leave,
right? And
then you're going to just explode into that, the notion of like a restrictive parent whose child goes to college and just gets hammered all the time. The other side of that is to be more indulgent and I'm going to be, and this is, I think, more typical of how parents tend to treat their adolescents now, is it's, I want to be your best friend. I want you to tell me everything. And, if something's going on, I want you to share it with me. And, it's okay. I'll never judge you. I'll never, and that doesn't ultimately work terribly well either, because you're not really giving them an ability to sort of think about what is right, what isn't right, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. You're not really giving them the toolkit for figuring out how to manage that transition into romantic relationships or social relationships in general. And so you have to
friendships. You don't go into friendships trying to raise someone. You're not.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
I don't, you
Right.
know, you don't have like, oh, my friend here, I'm trying to teach him confidence, and
Right.
no, your friends you're kind of non-judgmental about, and because you want to just because it's kind of this back and forth relationship. I like your company, you like my company,
Yeah.
but we're not going to get too involved in each other's lives. But
Right.
so go
And you see this like teenagers at much higher rates than before. There was a book recently similar to Hate's book about what was it? It was called iGen. It was basically this notion of people born after 1995. They're less likely to look forward to getting their driver's license.
Mhm.
They're
Yeah.
more likely to go to dinner with their parents. They're basically their parents are more friends of theirs, and their parents will drive them around longer. And I mean, most of us for our generation, that was like the biggest thing we couldn't wait for, is to get that independence. And it wasn't because we didn't love our parents or anything like that. It was just, that was a big marker when we could go interact socially on our own without needing our parents to drive us there, or without needing to sort of find alternative forms. And now that most of that interaction doesn't happen socially necessarily, it's just not the same. And so I think the middle ground is, I mean, I wouldn't presume to tell any parent this is what you should do, because I don't think it's that cut and dry, and I'm certainly not the person to be telling people what to do. But the ideal is, you really need to, conversation is key. So and this is throughout childhood, but especially in adolescence, is finding ways, and each teenager will be different in this, but finding ways to have conversations about that process of identity development. So if you find out they're interested in something, trying to engage them in that aspect. If you find they have a new friend, or every parent's probably worst nightmare when they start getting excited about romantic relationships and dating, finding ways to sort of check your preconceptions about all that at the door, and just try to engage them in conversation. Because I think the thing they miss in friendships now that maybe used to be there is that dialogue about what's going on, and taking what's internal and putting it into a conversation. And by doing that, you're setting them up at least to think about what's going on. And in terms of friendships, then that's kind of encouraging that behavior is going to be more likely then to lead to that behavior consistently in their other relationships. So I think but doing that without sort of sacrificing the fact that you are the parent in that role. So you still set the expectations. And so that's a hard dynamic to balance, to give autonomy, but also have that connection there. It's a difficult role. It's also different with each teenager. Some teenagers are going to be more, more likely to push back, but it's also something you can't just start when they're teenagers, because if that process hadn't been there throughout childhood, then it's just going to come across as fake and false. And teenagers are really good at picking up on that.
Okay. Well, I think you feel good.
I feel okay.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thanks for coming on. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate the time. And, next time you have a failed relationship, you can feel free to call me. Or post it on social media, whichever you prefer.
Yep. Yeah, I'll do both. I'll send an Instagram of me with a sad face, eating ice cream
That'll
on
be
the
my
couch.
cue.
All right. Take care, my friend.
All right. See you later, buddy.
Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. If so, head over to iTunes and give us a review and rating. That definitely helps with iTunes popularity. Also, you can visit our Facebook page. Go to Facebook, type in "Why Do We Do That?" and click like. I always post episode reminders as well as some articles occasionally related to the prior episode. You can also email me at whydowedothatpodcast@gmail.com. That's whydowedothatpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?